In the second part of chapter 9, the architectural pattern of animals, we discuss in some details about animal tissues. The organization and combination of tissues in the body gives rise to organs capable of specific and specialized functions that in turn is key to the diversification of animals on Earth. There are four major types of animal tissues. The epithelial tissues, which form external coverings and internal linings of internal organs. Then you have connective tissues that binds tissues and organs together, as well as serving specialized functions such as transport and energy storage. The muscular tissues are generally contractile tissues that enable whole organism locomotion or for internal transport of body fluids or digestive materials. The nervous tissue, on the other hand, is specialized for signal and control of body functions. In the following slides, let's take a look at each of these tissues in some detail. Epithelial tissues form sheets of cells that covers the external and internal surfaces of the body. Outside the body, they form the skin, which forms a protective covering. And inside the body, especially in hollow organs, they form linings of body cavities inside hollow organs. They're often combined with connective tissues, like as shown here. You have simple squamous epithelium that is underlaid with connective tissue. So like the skin, for example, our skin, made up of stratified stratified squamous epithelium. The underlying tissue is a fibrous connective tissue we call dermis. Epithelial tissues are derived embryonically from ectoderm germ layers. They are highly cellular, as you can see. They are mainly made up of cells, and their classification may be based on cell shape, squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, and the number of cell layer, simple when made up of only one cell layer, stratified when there are more than one layer of cells. There's also a pseudo-stratified classification among what's this, tissues found in the trachea. They are actually made up of one layer of cells, but because of the apparent uh, differences of their height, the cellular height, they appear under the microscope as having different, rather several layers, but in fact they are made up only of a single layer of tall cells, those found in the trachea. So you have cell shape and number of cell layer that we use for classification of uh, epithelial tissue. The bottom tissue here shown is a transitional epithelium, which is common in the organs that are subjected to stretching, like the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is lined by this transitional epithelium that is usually rounded up when they are in a relaxed state, but when they are stretched, these round cells become stretched as well and they flatten out. So we call this as transitional epithelium in organs that are subjected to stretching. Epithelial tissues are also characterized to be avascular, that is, they are devoid of blood vessels, as you can see here. You don't see any blood vessel uh, crisscrossing the tissue. They are highly avascular, and it is fortunate that they are uh, not embedded with blood vessels because they form the surfaces of the body, whether external or internal. And abrasion, which is often common on surfaces, may be dangerous if we had blood vessels on the tissue, in these epithelial tissues. So by evolution, they're avascular. Um, all epithelial tissues are always anchored on a non-cellular um, component or layer we call as basement membrane. The basement membrane is actually an amorphous layer of uh, materials that is a product of both the epithelial cells and the underlying uh, connective tissue. So this forms the basement membrane, of which all epithelial cells are anchored on. Connective tissues are the most diverse group of tissues in animals' body that serve various binding and supportive functions. They are derived from the mesoderm, and they're usually typically composed of three main parts: cells, fibers like collagen, and ground substance, which are amorphous products of the cells themselves, by which the fibers and cells are embedded. So this is an embedding um, amorphous and most often semi-gelatinous material, which forms the matrix of most connective tissues. The various forms of connective tissues uh, show different proportions of these three main components of connective tissue: cells, fibers, and ground substance. For example, loose connective tissue, you have much more abundant ground substance here than there are fibers and cells, as it is apparent here. So the connective tissue is loose. It is able to deform as the prevailing conditions may allow it. And then you have dense connective tissue, which is predominantly occupied by fibers, collagen fibers particularly, that are densely packed together. And then you have sparse supply of cells that are indicated here by dark blue elongate nuclei, by which the fibers sort of squeeze the cells in between the fibers. And then you have very little, if at all, ground substance present in the dense connective tissue. Examples of dense connective tissue are ligaments and tendons, that are very important tissues that join muscles to bones when you have tendons, and when you join bones to bones by ligaments. So the first two tissues here shown are connective tissue proper, that is, they join tissues together, like loose connective tissues found in the underneath the epithelial tissue of digestive organs, and dense connective tissue such as those in tendons and ligaments. You also have connective tissue here, cartilage, which is made up of a large supply of matrix and some amounts of fibers which are not apparent here, with some cells, few cells, which are embedded in spaces within the ground substance or the matrix. We call the cells as chondrocytes, and the spaces at which they are embedded as lacunae. Here you have bone. Bone is a highly specialized connective tissue for support and protection. They are formed by a concentric ring of osteocytes, which are also located in osteocytes, with a central Haversian canal by which blood vessels and nerves traverses. You have shown here are units of osteon or ostia, which forms the basic structures of bone tissue, with cells that are concentrically arranged around a central Haversian canal, osteon or ostia. And this particular connective tissue, the bone, is rather a specialized connective tissue. That is, they serve to support the soft tissues of the body, as well as to protect it. Like, for example, the brain case of the skull houses the brain, and the hip bones, the sacral bones, partially protects the and hides the internal reproductive organs, or the rib cages, for example, that houses the delicate organs of the lungs, the heart, and other internal organs. So you have bones that are specialized for support and protection of internal organs. Other connective tissues that are also specialized are not shown here, like blood, which is important for the transport of nutrients and other important materials like gases. Blood is a connective tissue specialized for transport. And fat tissue as well, adipose tissue, is another connective tissue that is not shown here. It's specialized for energy storage in the form of triglycerides stored in the fat cells. So you have connective tissues that are either for joining the tissues together or for specialized functions. Muscle tissue is the most abundant tissue in the body of most animals. They are derived from the mesoderm, and they are made up of three basic types of muscle tissue. You have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. They can be differentiated according to their cell appearance and the location of the muscle and their function, whether they are voluntary or involuntary. The skeletal muscle is made up of elongate, blunt-ended cells that appear striated. That is, they have alternating dark and light bands all throughout the length of the muscle fiber. They have nuclei, that is, they have multiple nuclei within each muscle fiber that are located just underneath the plasma membrane. So they have peripheral nuclei. Most of the volume of the cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle cell is therefore filled up by contractile myofibrils we call myosin and actin that form striations all throughout the length of the muscle fiber. The locations of skeletal muscle are mostly at the bones. They are connected to bones by which they can pull on the bones and therefore move certain body parts. Some skeletal muscles at the face are also attached partially to the skin so that it enables us to make expressions or facial movements by which we can express our emotional states. But most often the skeletal muscles are attached to bones of the body. Then the cardiac muscles, they are mainly made up of branching, elongate, striated cells which have nuclei that are often centrally located. So branching, striated muscle fibers that have nuclei that are centrally located. The adjacent cardiac muscle fibers are usually interdigitated or connected with interdigitation of their ends so that they have certain regions that are densely stained that crosses the muscle fiber. We call this as intercalated discs. Cardiac muscles are mostly located at the walls of the heart, and they are under the autonomic regulation, so they are involuntary in function. The smooth muscles, on the other hand, are made up of small spindle-shaped cells. That is, they have a large bulbous middle with tapering ends. They have centrally located nuclei, and they don't show any apparent striations all over. And they're located mostly at the walls of internal organs like digestive organs, blood vessels, hollow organs like urinary bladder, urethra, they make up the walls of these internal organs, and being under autonomic regulation, the smooth muscles are also involuntary in function compared to the skeletal muscle, which is under somatic control, and so they are voluntary in function. The nervous tissue is specialized for the reception of stimuli and conduction of impulses from one cell to another. The nervous tissue is derived from the ectoderm, and they're composed mainly of two main types of cells: the neuron, which are shown here as large stellate cells, and neuroglia, of which are only apparent here by their nuclei, but they are the most numerous of the cells here. These tiny dots are their nuclei. The neurons are highly irritable cells. They can respond to various stimuli, especially stimuli coming from other cells like neurons, sensory neurons, for example, or any changes in the physical state of the body. They respond to this, and they're also able to generate signals in the form of action potentials and nerve impulses that are waves of action potentials that propagate along their nerve fibers until they reach other cells, which the signals by which the signals are transmitted by neural transmission. And so they can communicate with each other and with other cells by passing on signals. And these signals are usually signals that can generate responses to various stimuli. And so the nervous tissue is a tissue that mainly forms the nervous system, that is one of the major control systems of the body. The neuroglia actually are composed of different types of non-neural cells, but all of their functions support the workings of the neuron. Some form a myelin sheath covering over the nerve fibers that enable the nerve cells or the neurons to transmit signals in a very quick way. And some neuroglia also, like white blood cells, they engulf debris and other materials that are not needed within the nervous tissue. Other types of neuroglia, like ependymal cells, produce the cerebrospinal fluid that circulate around the nervous tissue, especially at the ventricles or spaces within the brain and spinal cord. Some neuroglia also simply hold on to neurons and to each other to establish an integrated and stable tissue. These are the astrocytes that extend cytoplasmic extensions to other cells nearby, by which they can hold onto the cells, and so they stabilize the whole nervous tissue with the astrocytes. So the most diverse kind of cells found in the nervous tissue may be the neuroglia, but neurons may also be classified according to their shape and their functions. Like, according to shape, there are neurons that have many cytoplasmic extensions, and so they are called multipolar. And there are also neurons that are made that have only two cytoplasmic extensions or fibers. These are bipolar, and some have, especially sensory neurons, have only one cytoplasmic extensions or fibers, which are called unipolar. Neurons may also be classified as either sensory, that is, they detect and transmit sensory signals from sensory organs to the central nervous system. And then you also have motor neurons that transmit command signals from the central nervous system to the effector organs of the body, like glands and muscles. And then you have interneurons, most of which are located within the central nervous system, that convey signals from sensory neurons to motor neurons and to one another. The interneurons make up the bulk of the nervous tissue in the central nervous system. Most complex grades of animals, those having tissues and organ systems, um, permit or to some extent promote evolution of large body size. Um, the These large body size, however, have physical and ecological consequences on them. For example, the size is inversely proportionate to the surface area. So the larger the size rather, the smaller the surface area is. So smaller animals therefore have a larger surface area relative to the volume of their body than large animals, which have relatively large volume or mass of their body relative to the smaller surface areas they have. But this has been overcome by evolutionary solutions in large animals, such as there is great infoldings of their body surfaces, which allow for the formation of respiratory organs or digestive organs and and cardiovascular system. In some animals that are not as highly evolved, they have flattened their bodies, like among the flatworms. They have flattened their bodies so that much of the body is near the body surfaces. The advantages of having a large surface is that they have greater buffering against the environmental fluctuations because of the presence of highly specialized organs, which are formed by internal infoldings of the surfaces. So with internal organs, they are well uh, protected against the drastic fluctuations of external conditions compared to smaller, uh, simpler animals. They also have greater protection against predation because they are larger, they are much more capable of moving about, they have endowed with lots of choices where to go and with greater protection against predation. And they are also enhanced offensive tactics. So, and then the large size also permits efficient use of metabolic energy because of the presence of highly specialized organs and organ systems. So this ends chapter 9 about the architectural pattern of the animal body, and we move on to chapter 10 about taxonomy and phylogeny. See you then.